Hello and welcome to the third video in a series of 5 on middle pair. My name is Ben Hayles and this is brought to you by Postfloppoker.com. In the first video I did a brief introduction to middle pair, and in the second one I discussed equity and board texture and how equity is such an important concept in your decision making. So too is post-flop scenario. You're going to be entering any post-flop situation in one of six generic categories. And for those of you familiar with my work, you may know I've written a book on post-flop called Postflop, bizarrely enough, which does this for every single type of flop. It divides every type of flop up into these 6 scenarios. So it's something I believe is really useful for compartmentalizing really complicated information. If you're not familiar with the 6 post-flop scenarios, don't worry. You can still follow along fairly easily. The first post-flop situation, PS1, is when you're the raiser in position and your opponent checks the flop. So it's the best possible situation. You being the aggressor is an advantage, being in position is an advantage, and your opponent has shown weakness by not being the aggressor and by checking post flop. Normally in this spot we're going to be c-betting for value, and with middle pair we're generally going to have some value in making the bet. In certain specific spots you may consider checking behind for pot control reasons. So for example, if you're holding King 5 on a dry board of Ace King 6. It's not entirely dry because of the quite high likelihood of a straight draw, but it'll be a gut shot. It's not so dangerous to check behind. And it does have this huge advantage of keeping the pot small when you're in danger of getting involved in a bigger pot if you start building it at the flop. Really, you want to think about pot control in spots when the chips that you stand to lose are of a greater value than the chips that you're going to gain by making your continuation bet. I think here you can actually do quite a bit of bluff catching in this type of spot, which counterbalances it and puts it in favor of sometimes checking behind. So don't just auto c-bet every flop. Middle pair, it's not a hand you really want huge pots with, so pot control, definitely you're going to be wanting to do it some of the time. On the turn, you have 2 options. You can either, assuming your opponent doesn't make an interruption bet, you can either double barrel, which I suggest you do on good barreling cards, or you can take a more defensive line of raise, bet, check, and then call the river, because you're probably, if you take this line, you'll probably find there's lots of bluffs in your opponent's range for betting at the river. So yeah, I like this line quite a lot. Raise, c-bet, and then sometimes check behind, as long as the board's not super wet and dangerous. Check behind, and then if your opponent bets at the river, you can call. If your opponent just checks, you could consider value betting, depending on whether you think you've got value, or you can check behind again, and you've got to the river nice and cheap. The second betting line there, raise, bet, check, is if you double barrel, and usually on the river you're not going to have any reason for triple barreling unless you are so confident your opponent is ahead of you, but you still believe you can take him off the hand with a triple barrel. well, then you've got the option of making that very brave bluff. Good luck to you. It's worth trying from time to time, but it's not, it's not a play you should be making every time you're playing middle pair. And that's the point there I make there. So triple barreling is possible as an outright bluff. And the last point I make, I want to repeat, I'm going to be making this throughout, but when you get raised and you're holding middle pair, 9 times out of 10, you should be folding. You're just not going to have the right situation for continuing. This post-flop scenario is the best of them, and I'm still saying, look, if you get raised, it's normally going to be best to fold. Okay, so in post-flop scenario 2, it's exactly the same scenario, except this time your opponent leads with a donk bet, and this changes things up because your opponent's donk betting range is going to be different from his checking range. And you need to know a little bit about your opponent and his tendencies in order to cope with that. So my first point is, much depends on which hands your opponent donk bets with. And just as a quick warning, the most common hand for donk betting is top pair. That's not a good hand to be up against when you're holding middle pair. Having said that, in general, you're still going to be in good shape because although top pair is the most common hand, there are a whole bunch of other hands that are possible. Calling in position often makes sense. If the bet's really small, then you can raise. Raising is also an option against wide-ranged opponents who are donk betting a lot. Then I think raising is definitely superior. But there's nothing wrong with just calling in position. Are there times when I would fold to a donk bet with middle pair? Yeah. Usually against real nits who are just, I know that they don't donk bet without at least top pair. In those spots, I don't see any value in continuing. But I would need to know that my opponent had that weakness in his game, that he only led with really, really strong hands. You do want some balance in your donk betting range. That's something I learned only very recently, is that, the fact that I only lead out with such a small percentage of hands is a real giveaway. And I've had to find some balance. I've had to find a few other types of hands that I donk bet with in order to keep my opponents guessing. Still keep your donk betting percentage very small, but just make sure that there's balance. Anyway, I'm coming off topic. Betting lines. So in post-flop scenario 2, I recommend, so you've raised pre-flop and been donk bet into, so normally call, and if your opponent checks, you obviously then go ahead and bet the turn. Or you raise the donk bet, and depending on what your opponent does next, you're going to continue or fold. In post-flop scenario 3, you have the raiser out of position, and this is more challenging. Again, as with the scenario 1, I'm recommending c-betting for value in general. That's the default play. However, you can take a line of check calling. It's fraught with danger, I'm afraid. But the reason why c-betting is superior is just simply that it generates immediate fold equity, and it makes more money for that reason. So yeah, if you're in doubt, go with the c-bet. So here's my recommending betting lines. There's sort of standard betting lines that occur when you're out of position. So raise, bet, double barrel, and then maybe check call, or raise, bet, and then move to check calling. Raise, bet, check. If your opponent checks behind, you should probably bet the river for value, or check call, depending on whether you believe there is value on your river bet. There may not be, and it'll depend on your opponent and on the precise situation. But they're the kind of common betting lines that will occur. Final point on post-flop scenario 3. I'm not going to say never check raise, because there are spots when it doesn't really matter what your hand is. You can exploit someone by check raising with any two. And so, if you're someone astute enough that they're able to employ that technique, then go ahead. But it's pretty unusual with a marginal made hand. You want to generally be check raising with a mixture of your really, really strong hands, and then a few drawing, semi-bluffing type hands thrown in. Marginal hand like middle pair is not normally the type of hand you should be check raising. Now, what about when you're defending the hand? So post-flop scenario 4, you're in position, you've maybe called a raise on the button, and you've flopped middle pair and you're facing a continuation bet. Normally, this is a reasonably healthy situation to be in, because you still have some really nice equity in the hand, and you've got that advantage of being in position. So normally call the c-bet. Raising's not going to make much sense, because calling keeps the pot smaller and also keeps in your opponent's weak hands. They're going to be c-betting with a mixture of all that air and some good hands. But at this point in the hand, if you raise, you're going to be knocking out a whole bunch of hands that you actually want to keep in. So for that reason, I prefer calling. I'm not going to say never raise. Raising may make sense in spots where you're committed and you actually would welcome the fold. You've only got middle pair. It would be kind of nice to just get rid of them, because there's not too many chips left behind, and the maths works out that way. On the turn, if your opponent, if you float the flop, which is what I'm recommending generally, then your opponent checks, then you're going to be betting. You're going to be doing this with a really nice balance as well, because you would do it with middle pair, but you would also do this with air. You're going to float the flop sometimes, and then pounce on any weakness. So I think this is great when your opponent checks the turn. Is just always bet, because you're going to be doing it with good hands and bad hands alike. It just makes sense. When your opponent bets at the turn, then you need to do a full reassessment of his more narrow range, and think about how well you're doing. Have you got the right odds to carry on? Often the answer will be no, but also sometimes it will be yes. So you just need to think about that. It's going to be complex at that point in the hand. So betting lines, the call pre-flop, then what I'm recommending is nearly always to call the continuation bet. And then on the turn card, sometimes you're going to be continuing. Sometimes that'll be by betting, calling, or folding. So all those lines definitely available. Post-flop scenario 5 is when you're the defender in position and your opponent fails to make a continuation bet. Now, I'm going to be betting 80-85% of the time in this type of spot. So with middle pair, I don't see any reason not to make the bet. It just makes sense. I mean, you could exercise pot control immediately by checking behind, especially if you think that your opponent is one of these guys who likes to check raise flops. There are people who make a habit of doing this, and it's not a bad strategy, I have to say, because of the fact that I'll probably bet in PS5 too often. The guy against me in PS3 should check raise more often, or with a bigger range, in order to exploit me. That's not going to stop me making this bet very frequently, though, and I think you should be doing the same thing, regardless of what your holding is in many ways. With middle pair, I definitely like betting. If your opponent calls, then the turn card, you have to work out whether to double barrel. I wouldn't be double barreling too often. If you get a good turn card, or the board's really wet and you think your opponent is drawing, then yeah, go ahead and make the double barrel, but don't go overboard. Don't be afraid of just checking the street. Even if the board is a bit wet, it can be worth keeping the pot smaller, taking the defensive line. It can be just simply a better play. On dry boards, I would recommend using the turn to check behind. I think it makes sense to use your showdown equity, which is likely pretty strong. You may catch a few bluffs from your opponent on the river, and you've got a good option being in position on the river. You can potentially choose the river to value bet if you think that your opponent may call with some worse hands. Now, your opponent does have the option of making a surprise bet on the turn, or to check raise you. If either of these two things happen, I would tend to fold. In my experience, these are signals that your opponent is probably strong, or he's making a good play with a semi-bluffing hand. And occasionally you just have to give up the best hand in that spot, so don't be afraid of just folding. So betting lines in PS5, call pre-flop, bet the flop, double barrel the turn, call pre-flop, bet the flop, check behind for pot control, call pre-flop, bet the flop, and then fold to a surprise bet, or a check raise if it happened on the flop, and then call, bet the flop, and then bet fold on the turn if you get check raised on the turn. It's a painful line when you fold on the turn, having double barreled, but it's entirely credible. You've got to sometimes listen to your opponent and his bets, and once you've reassessed your equity, you will find that folding in that spot is normally going to be your best option. Okay, the final one, post-flop scenario 6, which puts you in the worst of the 6 post-flop situations. You're defending the hand and you're out of position. I am going to be fairly useless. It's incredibly equal, all the different lines you can take, and it really does depend on exactly what the circumstances are. Betting with a lead out bet, which may be a donk bet, check calling, check raising, check folding, all these lines seem viable. I think check raising is an unusual one, as I've said before, but if you're holding a draw, and I haven't talked much about if you're holding a draw with your middle pair, But if you are holding a draw with your middle pair, your equity is much better, and so check raising may make some sense, giving you fold equity, and you've got some substantial equity to go with your fold equity. So it's quite a good idea when you're holding a draw. Most of the time you're not holding a draw though, and I wouldn't be check raising with just 20% equity behind me. Check call is good against loose, aggressive opponents. Yes, it is. I don't like utilizing check call too often with a hand this marginal. It's like playing a guessing game, and you're never really gathering that much more information about your opponent and his range, because you're taking such negative betting lines. However, it can just be the best line against players that just keep throwing chips at you with really loose bets. Learning how loose your opponent is and whether or not it really makes sense to keep calling down with middle pair is a very difficult task. Try not to do it too often, but be aware that it's occasionally going to be the right approach. I like leading out sometimes with middle pair, especially in a situation where both ranges are really wide. And your opponent may be a bit loose at calling. Don't bets work well in those spots with just middle pair. Check folding is also fine against the opposite of those players in situations where you're facing a tight range. You've made a call, you weren't really wanting to flop middle pair, and you think your opponent's probably playing just really, really strong overpairs. Just check fold. Absolutely normal. Now, I want to say a quick word on multi-way pots because I've not mentioned them. You'll obviously have lower equity in multi-way pots with middle pair, and all the reasons why it's difficult to play middle pair against one opponent are multiplied against more than one. So it's difficult. It's tough to keep pots small. If you can stay around and keep a pot small, that's great, but you're also going to need to try and isolate. So what I recommend is usually make one attempt around the flop stage to get down to one opponent or even win the pot, and then if that fails and you're encountering resistance, give up, because usually people are pretty honest in multi-way pots, or more honest, so you won't get as many bluff raises or bluff bets. So you can tend to believe people when they're making strong plays. So make a strong play yourself. If it doesn't work, tend to just let it lie. Having position is also a really, really important factor in a multi-way pot. So I'm going to be more inclined to continue if I've managed to isolate and keep myself in position. Whereas if I end up out of position, I'm much less inclined to want to continue to turn and river. Okay, so that concludes the slides on the 6 post-flop scenarios. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and in the next one I'm going to be talking about how stack to pot ratio affects our decision making. My name's Ben Hayles. Thank you for listening.